Let's wait another minute or two as people are still coming in. Let me welcome you to our webinar today on shifting power. As people are still joining us, let me mention to you that this webinar will also be live streamed on Facebook. So you can find us on our Wendland Cook program Facebook page, and we'd be happy for you to share if you want to share that live stream on your social media platforms. Okay, let me welcome everybody to this Wendland Cook program in Religion and Justice's webinar. This is our webinar series on religion and labor. This is our third one, and you can see the earlier ones on our Facebook page, and I believe also on our webpage, which is religionandjustice.org. So welcome to today's session, which is titled Shifting Power, the Working Majority Transforming Religion and Politics. My name is Joerg Rieger. I am the director of the Wendland Cook program and a professor of theology at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. I was planning to co-moderate this discussion with Francisco Garcia, who is the graduate research fellow in the Wendland Cook program and one of my PhD students. Unfortunately, Francisco is not feeling well, even though he's doing better now. We're glad to hear about that. So we're sending good wishes and energy to Francisco and hope he'll feel even better soon. Sorry he couldn't be here today. You'll hear from him in one of the next webinars. Let me also say a quick word to all of the participants. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the conversation that we'll have in a few minutes at the end of this webinar. We're especially glad to have this conversation in the historical moment in this country in the aftermath of what is truly shaping out to be a historical political presidential election. At the Wendland Cook program in Religion and Justice, we are investigating how various religions can contribute to a better world, becoming part of the solution rather than remaining part of the problem. In this work, we're aided by liberative theologies around the world, and we truly see hope emerging in unexpected places. In that, we're finding that those who are most affected by the pressures of our time are not merely victims. They're also becoming agents and, in many cases, leaders. This gives us hope. In this climate, we seek to contribute our part to a re-emerging spirit of solidarity, a spirit that was long declared missing or simply impossible. Allow me to say a few words about our webinar today. In the aftermath of what may have well been the most important political election of our lifetimes, we need to take another look at the flow of power. For good reasons, at this moment, we're deeply concerned with political power, especially what is going to happen in Washington with a new president and new compositions of the House of Representatives and the Senate. In this webinar, we want to broaden the focus on political power, however, and investigate how political power is deeply entangled with other forms of power, including cultural, religious, and economic power. This is why we have invited leaders from the labor movement, and this is why we will be talking about religion and faith as well. The following questions are before us. Can political, cultural, and religious power really change without changing the economic strongholds of power that fund them all? How might shifts in economic power, often assumed to be the least likely to change, support shifts in political power everywhere? And what could be the role of the working majority and people of faith as we shape the flows of power in our country? And finally, is it possible that faith and labor together can help us overcome America's inequalities? This is a question that Rosemarie Henkel-Rieger and I put in the subtitle of our book, Unified Warrior Force. Before we jump into the conversation, let me provide you a few instructions on how audience participation will work. At the end of the conversation, there will be some time for Q&A, and you can post your questions in the Q&A section that you find at the bottom of your screen. If somebody else's question is of interest to you, you can vote for it, and thereby floating it to the top. We'll be starting with the questions that have the most votes that we assume would be the questions that the audience really would like to discuss. You can post questions at any time during the conversation, but we may only get to them towards the end. Be aware of that. Now it's my pleasure, and this is a great pleasure, to include the two panelists that are with us today. The first one is Betty Hung, who is the staff director at the UCLA Labor Center, where she oversees strategic programs, operations, and teaches social justice lawyering in the labor studies program. For over 20 years, Betty has been a social justice advocate with significant experience in multiracial values-based coalition and alliance building. She has played an integral role in several workers' rights, racial justice, immigrant rights, and education equity campaigns. As an attorney committed to implementing legal strategies that support grassroots leadership and organizing, Betty also served on the legal team that litigated the El Monte Thai and Latino garment worker case, and the legal team supporting the leadership of Dream LA in the successful campaign to win Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is DACA. Also an active faith leader, Betty served as the board co-chair of Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, CLU, where she facilitated faith and labor partnerships. Welcome, Betty. It's great to have you with us today. Next, let me introduce KB Brower, who is the organizing director for Bargaining for the Common Good. She's also a fellow at the Center for Innovation and Worker Organizing at Rutgers University. After organizing alongside janitors on her college campus, she got her start in the labor movement with SEIU 1199 New England, and she made her way back to college organizing as domestic campaigns director for United Students Against Sweatshops. After her term ended with USAS, she began work with AFSCME 3299, where she learned what's possible when unions and community partners team up to run common good campaigns. She most recently moved back to her hometown of Philadelphia, where she organized with the PA Nurses Union, Pennsylvania Nurses Union, and where she has worked with the AFGE to create an organizing program with locals around the country. Following her call to deepen her spiritual relationship to social justice, KB recently completed her first year at Union Theological Seminary, and she's pursuing ordination in the Episcopal Church. It's great to have you with us, KB. Welcome. Welcome to both of you. So let's move on to our questions. The first question has to do with the fact that many Americans understand the importance of engaging in politics. After all, that's part of the history of our country. This is what keeps our democracy alive. However, fewer Americans understand the importance of engaging in matters of the economy and of labor in particular. At the Wendland Cook program, we believe that the two things belong together: engagement in politics and engagement in economics and labor, and that the two can strengthen each other. as an initial question to begin, and let me put the question to Betty first and then move on to KB afterwards. So the first question, what's your sense of how labor and the identity of working people showed up in this election cycle, Betty?
Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here and really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. So thank you. Um, I think as we, consider the role of labor in the most recent presidential election, as you mentioned, this being one of the most monumental elections in our lifetimes, I think we have to really take a step back and acknowledge that it was voters of color that were responsible for President-elect Joe Biden's victory. And so as we think about labor, really examining that intersection of labor and race. And so I want to lift up the role that labor played, particularly some of the unions with significant worker of color memberships. So for example, the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Unite Here, which represents hotel and hospitality workers, and many others that really invested resources on the ground in battleground states to get out the vote. So I want to highlight one example that I think it really embodies the impact that labor played in the context of race. So Unite Here, right, the union that represents hotel and hospitality workers, they actually had one of the largest get out the vote efforts nationally, including knocking on the doors of 3 million voters in battleground states such as Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona. I mean, in Philadelphia alone, they contacted over 500,000 voters. And so laid off unemployed workers who have been so hard hit by this pandemic, but yet, making calls, texting, canvassing. I mean, their efforts as working people of color really made a critical difference in this election. I think it's also important to highlight that many of these labor unions also partnered with grassroots community organizations. So we see these labor and community alliances on the ground that really made an impact in the presidential election. I think, and in addition, labor, I think, plays a role on the state and local level in those races as well. And in places like Arizona, immigration was also a factor. So as we think about this election that really was about the heart and soul of our democracy and whether our democracy will survive, I think it's important to highlight that it was working people of color who really played such a critical role.
Thank you so much, Betty. This is really crucial, and this is a story that has to be told because a lot of people, I don't think, have quite realized that yet. Probably our listeners know about it, but for all of us to bring back into our memories, what is it that really moved us here is crucial. So thanks for getting us started on the right foot here. KB, how would you respond to that question about the role of labor and working people in this election cycle?
It's wonderful to be here, and I just love Betty so much, and I'm laughing because I was taking little notes about what I was going to say, and it's like word for word what Betty said. But I want to expand on it a little bit and talk about Philly, which was obviously such a game changer and really turned this election. And I organize and live in Philly, so you're welcome, everyone. But what Betty said is true, is that it was Black and brown workers that brought this home. So Trump won Pennsylvania in the last election. He didn't win it this time. And there is a specific reason for that. And I would also shout out Unite Here in Philadelphia. And the reason that they were able to have such a gigantic GOTV strategy is because that's a union in Philadelphia that for years has built a really engaged membership, an active membership, a membership that really sees themselves as the union, and has worked on both workplace issues, but has a history of fighting for a broader set of issues, helping elect the most progressive district attorney in the country, running campaigns for paid sick leave and winning. So these thousands of workers in Philadelphia had learned how to talk to their coworkers effectively and move them to action. And so when the time came to go and knock doors and to make phone calls, this was an experienced group of thousands of people who knew how to fight, knew how to talk to people, knew how to win, and could go out and talk to their neighbors, talk to the people in the community. And that's what turned Philadelphia, and it's what turned Pennsylvania. And the other piece of it is that there in Philly, there's an interfaith group called Power that works really closely with Unite Here and the other unions. They had long-standing relationships that they built over many years that they could then use in this moment to do incredible numbers of turnout and do a GOTV program with hundreds of people. It doesn't happen overnight. It's the product of long, deep organizing and relationship building, both within the worksite, but then between unions and interfaith groups and clergy.
Those are just fascinating stories, and it gives me a lot of hope to see that these things are happening in our country. A lot of this is certainly not seen from outside the country either, and so spreading the word far and wide. Our webinars are always international, so the word is getting out. And that's a story that needs to be told. I think what's changing, though, is not just the perception of the labor movement, but the labor movement itself, as you're telling it. And there's new grassroots energy, diversity, especially coming from groups that have not always been considered as the strongholds of labor. But let me combine that with what KB was just indicating. There's an interfaith movement also, you said, in Philadelphia and other places. So I'm curious about your assessment. How did faith communities help? What's happening there? Is there also change that we can be proud of?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a story that is both really inspiring and optimistic, and there's a lot of work to do. And I would say in Philly that the relationship that's been built between the interfaith groups, the clergy, they're doing real new organizing, right? Not just getting all the people that agree with you together, which it's easy to do, but going out and talking to new clergy and new congregations and trying to expand their base. And I think it's that deep organizing that's setting the stage for obviously winning the election, but actually a broader set of victories in a place like Philly, like electing a working families candidate for city council, Kendra Brooks, single Black mom. So, and a broader set of winning paid family sick leave. We just also won one of the biggest economic engines in the city is University of Pennsylvania. They weren't paying taxes like a lot of rich corporations don't. Just yesterday, they won $100 million into the schools, into public services. And it's not by accident, right? It is this long, deep organizing. And, you know, I would say the work that needs to be done is that it's really based in Philly. And when you look at that map of where people voted, who they voted for, it's Philly and Pittsburgh, and it's a sea of red. And where the long, deep organizing isn't happening within faith communities, we're losing, right? Where it is happening, we're winning. It's almost so simple that it's ridiculous. And you can see little pockets where unions and faith groups have a little bit more of a stronghold, where they made where we have less Trump supporters, you know, where the unions and faith groups have come together and started to move people, meeting them where they're at first, and then engaging them politically. So I think it's actually just kind of so clear where the work needs to go.
Thanks, and I like that word of that expression of deep organizing. That's really a great description, I think, of what we're facing, what we're also seeing. So Betty, what's happening? What do you see happening in the LA area?
Yeah, thank you, and I so appreciate the way KB framed it around that deep organizing, and the deep relationships also between multi-faith, interfaith groups and labor. So, you know, I want to just share that I think in Los Angeles, when we think about the transformation of labor unions and the kind of organizing and the sense of power, right, or empowerment of workers, it really goes back in so many ways to Reverend James Lawson Jr., who has such deep ties to Vanderbilt. But part of the story is, I think, the role that nonviolence has played and that Reverend Lawson has played in the transformation of the labor movement in LA, and how that has actually been critical in impacting elections and the landscape around power. So, for example, going back to Unite Here, when Maria Elena Durazo, who is now a state senator in California, when she was elected to become the head of Unite Here Local 11, which was a monumental victory for a Latina from an immigrant family to head the union, she called Reverend Lawson. And Reverend Lawson then trained and worked with the hotel workers with a nonviolence approach about really tapping into their power, right? Their inner power and the gift of life within every single worker. So when we think about power, oftentimes it's political, or it's framed as political machinations, but really it's this reframing of power that it's fundamental within every worker. And so Local 11 was transformed, where workers tapping into their own power and nonviolence then really organized, transformed the union, built power, and were a critical part of also transforming the LA County Federation of Labor. So, and that led to a lot of organizing around electoral organizing that has actually been instrumental in turning Southern California, not just LA, but Orange County as well, blue, right, towards more progressive values. And so I think there is this deep connection between faith communities and nonviolence, and and the kind of organizing that we need to shift power. So for example, Reverend Lawson founded CLUE, Clergy and Lady United for Economic Justice. And CLUE in the recent elections also took a nonviolence approach and did things like, a blessing at a vote center, really calling for everyone's voices and votes to be heard, and to counter voter suppression. And also being prepared that given that President Trump is not conceding, and it does not seem like he's going to accept a peaceful transfer of power, how can the faith community play a role in de-escalation and nonviolence and ensuring that our democracy remains strong?
Thank you so much. One thing I've always learned from Reverend Lawson myself is his notion of nonviolence, and always saying it has to be nonviolent resistance. So it's exactly like you're saying, it's an active approach. It is not the passivity in the face of the challenge, but it's actually doing something in a way that is fresh, that is new, and in some ways unexpected, I guess, also in the current climate, for sure. So thank you so much. Let me move us on to the second question, because I think we've already started talking about it. But to deepen that a bit more in terms of religious communities, when I go around religious communities, most religious communities are familiar with providing charitable support. Some of them advocate for justice, and sometimes I know religious communities are joining protests in the street. What's less frequent in my experience, and I think that might match yours, is that religious communities get involved in building broad-based economic power. And of course, even fewer religious communities have a history of addressing the concerns of people at work or of collaborating with the labor movement. That's of course true here in the southeast of the United States, where the Wendland Cook program is located. I think LA and the Northeast, you have maybe a slightly more progressive attitude. So the two of you have been involved in doing this kind of work, sometimes from the side of labor and sometimes also from your position as members of religious communities. So I'm curious about some of the examples. You've already given us some, but I know starting with KB, you are working with bargaining for the common good. In that framework, where do you see faith communities making a difference, and maybe faith and labor working together in new ways that could be inspiring for all of us.
Mm. Well, I just think it's like the most important partnership in the world to transform our economic and political system. And, just to share two quick anecdotes, I ran a campaign in rural Pennsylvania one time where 80% of the population voted for Trump, and where the nurses really wanted a union. And like we often do make the mistake of in the movement is we didn't engage the clergy, we didn't engage the churches. Although the nurses really wanted the union, at the end of the day, they voted no, because they listened to their clergy, and the clergy said, "Don't vote for that union," and they paired up with the hospital administrators. And so I think a lot of times we can make the mistake to, at the last minute, say, "Oh, we better work together," right? We have shared interests, and we better come to our rally or come to our event, right? And what bargaining for the common good is about is working together for the long term, deep long-term relationships, and also forming campaigns and formulating demands together. So just quickly, I'll share in Connecticut, there's a campaign right now that I'm working on where they're dealing with the twin pandemics of white supremacy and COVID. And across the state, they're going to face massive cuts and massive austerity. So, which are going to mostly impact or most severely impact communities of color. And so we could, education could fight for their piece of the pie, and healthcare and congregations could all fight for their own piece of the pie separately. But what we said is actually, let's do this differently. Let's work together. Let's formulate demands together and come up with a shared platform. And so what we did was we have a full proposal. There's unions in the coalition, there's community groups, and then there's clergy and different religious institutions. And they're working together to come up with a platform that is a set of a budget proposal for taxing the rich, not working people, in order to fund all of the things that are necessary. And we just have more power when we come together like that. And, in the first 5 months of the pandemic, billionaires made $5 billion in Connecticut, while working people were laid off, getting foreclosed on. And so where we landed on a couple of the demands that I think are really interesting is we said, okay, we're not just going to come up with the demands. We're going to talk to people. We're going to talk to the union members. Clergy are going to go back to their congregations and say, what are you most concerned about with this pandemic? So we went through a process of surveying congregations, of surveying community groups, surveying union members to find some shared issues across these places. And the two issues that we came to were people were worried about police violence, right? They were worried about their jobs. And we found this amazing issue where the healthcare workers said there's not enough social workers. Yeah, we don't have enough mental health resources. People in the community said, when we call 911 and are having a mental health crisis, a cop gets called instead of a social worker. So what's the problem here, right? And there aren't enough of them. So we teamed up and we're bargaining for more social workers and to intervene in that process so that instead of calling a cop when you're having a mental health crisis, you get a social worker, right? So people are not put in the line of violence there. So I think that's just one example, and we could think of a million of when you actually go and union members are talking with members of congregations and coming up with demands together. We can think more broadly about what's possible to win, and we can actually win more.
That is exciting, yeah, and it's happening. I mean, these are not just ideas; these are actual things before us, and we have the story to tell. So thanks for that, KB. Betty, you've been working in LA with CLU, Clergy, and later United for Economic Justice, and you've been involved from various sides yourself. What are your experiences there about how faith and labor work together?
Yeah, thank you. So in considering labor and faith coalitions, I think just taking a step back again and thinking about why, right? Like why is it so powerful and why come together? And I think it's critical to have an analysis around that. And again, Reverend Lawson is one of my heroes, and has, I think, such prophetic leadership. And so I want to turn again to his teachings around what he calls plantation capitalism. So if we really reflect on and analyze what kind of society we live in here in the US, we have to go back to the historical context around slavery, right? And the fact that our country is founded on racialized plantation capitalism. So this nexus of labor and race, again, and exploitation, and that system has just evolved. It hasn't gone away, but it's evolved to what we see today, where there are so many working people of color, who are toiling in exploitative conditions. And so why should labor and faith groups come together is, I think, one, that kind of exploitation and wage theft really goes against the values of every faith tradition, right? That it is antithetical to our values around the inherent dignity and humanity of every single person, that every person has that gift of life. And so given that, how do we as people of faith then, what can we do about dismantling the system of racialized plantation capitalism that has everyday impact, right? It's not theoretical, but instead it's the fact that COVID-19 has a disproportionate impact on workers of color and immigrant workers, and just exacerbating inequities that already existed. And so given this, how can we come together? So I just want to share one example. And again, I feel like, God was really working in this instant. And so last summer, the summer of 2019, grocery workers in California were on the verge of a strike. Tens of thousands of workers working at major grocery chains still did not have a contract. And so Clue, I was the board co-chair at the time, we had a meeting scheduled with a leader, the president of one of the UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers locals. And Reverend Lawson actually called me that morning about something else. And, I told him, given that he is the founder of Clue, that we were having this meeting with this labor leader who Reverend Lawson has known for decades. So he said, well, I should go then. So we had this meeting. It was a critical time in the campaign, and had a 2-hour strategy session where Reverend Lawson really shared his wisdom. And that led to really a moral framing of the campaign, and with clergy being involved in so many ways, including Reverend Lawson himself, right? Really framing it as a moral religious issue that 60% of grocery workers were working 2 or more jobs to make ends meet, 10% of grocery workers are homeless. And yet Ralph's Kroger's had made record profits of $3 billion with a B dollars the year before. So Reverend Lawson and other clergy, walked the picket lines, did delegations, sent in letters, provided pastoral care, spoke at press conferences, and really demonstrated coming together with the workers themselves and the labor unions that this is an issue, a moral issue that faith communities need to really stand up for. And so the workers won. They won a contract that summer. So I just want to share that the power, I think, of faith and labor, and really rising up to really live out our values.
Wow, yeah, that's just amazing. I mean, hearing your stories, even though some of us may know something, is really empowering and deepens anything that we could have imagined possible, especially in the current political moment. I mean, if you think about what we're up against, these are powerful forces in various ways, political, economic, as you have mentioned. Let me encourage our audience to start posting questions, because we will be going to questions soon. There are some questions coming in. I'm wondering if we can feed them into the conversation now, because what you're talking about, I mean, everybody here on the blog and in the Q&A is responding very strongly, seeing as hopeful message. Some are wondering, do you see this happening outside of the metropolitan areas also, right? I mean, KB, you were already talking about Connecticut, but you know, we're thinking Philly, we're thinking LA, and this is where it's working. But what do you see happening outside of some of these areas? And maybe you have some stories about those places also.
Okay, I can kick it off. Yes, so I think I do want to share a quick story from LA, but it applies to rural places too. But you know, I believe that people's hearts and minds can be changed. I really believe that, and I really think that it needs to happen because we see how many people voted for Trump. Our country is still very racist, and especially in rural areas, but even in Philly, it's everywhere. But I really believe that we can change people's hearts and minds, and that we have to have strategy of how we're going to do it. And one of my favorite anecdotes from the LA teachers who just went on strike recently. So they wanted to run a campaign to get cops out of K through 12 schools, right? Because the cops were really treating kids more like criminals than students. And so they wanted to run a campaign to say, get rid of, no cops on schools. This was extremely controversial internally. A lot of people did not agree with this, right? There were people who on the whole spectrum. So they said, okay, what can we do to move people? And so they held a concerted series of meetings where they had Black students share their stories about being victims of police violence at school, how it impacted them, how it impacted their lives. They shared these stories in small meetings with teachers who were on the fence or didn't really agree. And people actually changed their minds on this extremely polarizing issue. And they changed their minds because they heard the stories, because they connected with someone, and then they passed the vote, right? And they were able to actually win reducing cops in schools. And to me, this is like it makes me emotional even thinking about it. It really points the way forward that people can be moved, right? And what I found in rural Pennsylvania, that people's political views were so deeply rooted in their faith. I mean, so deeply rooted. And we couldn't, unless we met them there where they found their faith, we were never going to be able to move them, right? And I think that really points the way forward. And in a place like Connecticut, we're working in rural Connecticut, we're working in cities, we're working everywhere. But the way that people are able to be transformed is first you have to talk to them, right? In some places, we're not even going out and having the conversation yet, right? So going out and organizing in rural areas, meeting people where they're at, right? Having those conversations on winning on issues that they care about, right? So these nurses in rural Pennsylvania, white nurses who were experiencing horrible staffing levels, if we could have met them there and won on issues they care about and then begin to work. I remember one campaign I worked on where in a hospital, there was incredible tension between the Black and the white nurses. The Black nurses were mostly relegated to the night shift and the white nurses worked on day shift. And there was a lot of sentiment where, okay, it's the Black nurses who are the problem here. Once they started organizing a union and coming together, it really clarified who was the real problem. When they went to the negotiations table and they wanted a raise and they wanted safe staffing, and their CEO, walked in the room and said, you can't have that. It's not happening. It's not happening whether you're a white nurse or a Black nurse. People built relationships at the negotiations table. They understood that it was the CEO that was the real problem at creating this staffing crisis and not the other nurses. And people were fundamentally transformed through that process built relationships across, like, so we're saying the words, I see how racism exists in our hospital. So I think those two stories remind me that that people can be moved, and their hearts and minds can be changed, but we have to go build those relationships and do that deep organizing.
And it's not limited to the big cities, right? It happens everywhere. It happens in the rural areas. You know, for me as a theologian, what's so encouraging here is that you can actually, you know, tie into people's faith. And faith is not the conservative thing that it's oftentimes seen to be. I mean, it expresses itself that way, but if you go back to some of the ancient traditions, there's a lot of radical spirit, you know, back from Moses, you know, organizing a band of Hebrew slaves to Jesus. And currently scholars are rediscovering Paul. There's a radical edge in Paul fighting back against the Roman Empire. And here, the labor struggle and the political struggle helps us to reclaim faith in places where people actually care about faith, and it becomes energized in a new way. That's just fascinating. So thank you for that, KB. Betty, I saw you put the Poor People's Campaign in the chat here, and I know you have other examples as well about where this is happening in rural area where you see it.
Yes, so thank you. I so appreciate what you also just shared around kind of the radical traditions, or the reclaiming of faith, and what faith means, and the values around that. So I wanted to just highlight, in response to that question about organizing in rural communities, including with white folks in rural communities, that the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, which is co-chaired by Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, has been very intentional around what they call moral fusion organizing, and bringing together people of all faith backgrounds as well as who are not of faith, and of all races and ethnicities, rural, urban, across the country, to really be grounded in our values, our shared values. And so there's been amazing organizing through the Poor People's Campaign and in various communities. So I think it's like in 40 plus states now, and in so many communities, including rural communities, and bringing folks together. And so I would just offer that I think that work is happening on the ground, and we, sometimes don't see it, we don't hear it, but at the same time, it's happening. And so, there's a lot of discussion, I think, in the media around white evangelicals and this kind of portraying of people of faith as just being of that mindset, right? And yet, when we actually look at the election, I just saw that the Religion News Service published a piece where they actually cited that 80% of Christians who are people of color actually voted for Biden. I mean, which is so fascinating if we think about that, in relative to, I think it was 81% of white evangelicals voting for Trump. And so I think there is this this kind of narrow portrayal in the media of who are communities of faith, when in fact there's so many people of faith who really are called to be as inclusive as possible, right? To love our neighbor, to really act on love, or love in action, and so. So I think that's part of our challenge and our task ahead. How do we really demonstrate, right, through our actions, not just through our words, but praying with our feet as well, what our religious and moral values and traditions mean, and how are we realizing that and living that out? I mean, there's a saying that I love, and I'm paraphrasing, but that, the Bible someone reads may be what they see in your actions, right? Or something to that effect. And so I think how we show up, the values that we adhere to in how we organize, because sometimes, I mean, to be honest, organizing is transactional, it's politically expedient, it's dehumanizing, or can be. And so how do we come together, labor and interfaith communities, to organize in a way that really upholds and lives out our values of equity, justice, love, and inclusion. And I think that's really the key, and that's the kind of power and potential transformation that we hold.
Yeah, I mean, wow, there's so much to unpack here. I wish we had a lot more time to go into the responses that both of you gave to the questions. There's a final question I would like to answer to ask. This is a question that Francisco wrote up for us, and it is about the current situation in the U.S. With the election outcome determined, but yet still uncertain. Right? This is sort of this weird moment where we have a certified president-elect, yet we're still working in some ways. So here the question would be, what is your advice? What is next for working people? What is next for organized faith communities? What kinds of partnering, organizing, collaborations do you imagine? What has to be, put to the forefront right now in this moment? What do we need in order to move forward?
Go ahead, Betty.
Sure. So thank you. So I would just build on what I shared, and I think that what is really key is one, really starting from a place of our shared values and the moral and religious and faith traditions around the humanity, right? Inherent humanity and dignity of every human being, and to really build from love in action and loving our neighbors. So I think that's one, and I think second is to recognize again that we live in a society and system built on plantation capitalism. And so given that, how do we equalize the unequal power dynamics, right? And how do we address the inequities in the system? It's not just individual bigotry or discrimination, but it's really systemic and structural as well. And so a key to that, which is critical, is to recognize that when workers organize, that is essential to equalizing the power dynamic and to ensuring that there's can be equity and justice for workers. And what I mean by that is, for example, I know sometimes there is a labeling of labor unions as special interests, but really at its best, labor unions are the workers themselves, right? Workers themselves coming together to build power, to exercise and make their voices heard, which is so in alignment with our democratic values. So, if we look at what does union membership actually mean for workers, recognizing that the union membership rates have been declining, but I just want to share a few statistics to highlight why union membership is so valuable for workers from an equity perspective. So union members actually have 20 to 50% more in earnings than non-union members, right? So from an economic justice perspective, workers who are part of unions earn more, right? And they have a better chance of making a decent living for themselves and their families. This is even more magnified when it comes to workers of color who are union members. So union members who of color have nearly 5 times more wealth than non-union workers of color. And so it's just, if we want to consider racial equity and economic justice hand in hand, then union membership is actually a key to that. And so what can we as faith communities do, I think, is one, to really support worker organizing and worker organizations. That can be labor unions, worker centers, other associations, but really this idea of workers coming together. And I think it's important to highlight the risks that workers face when they stand up and organize, right? Can you imagine? I mean, think about reflecting for a moment on our own roles as workers, right? We're all workers. And so can you imagine going up to your employer, your boss, and saying, demanding better working conditions, better wages, and the kind of fear, right, that may invoke. But yet workers who organize face and confront that fear every day, right? And so from that perspective, how do we as faith communities walk alongside workers and really provide that kind of allyship and solidarity and support? And in so many campaigns that I've worked on, the kind of pastoral care and presence of clergy has been so critical. I mean, KB mentioned the teacher strike in Los Angeles. We at CLUE, again, partnered with UTLA, United Teachers of LA, around how could clergy provide pastoral support and organizing support in that campaign. So actually the morning that the strike ended, we were prepared to do a nonviolent civil disobedience action in LAUSD headquarters. And clergy, including Reverend Francisco Garcia, were going to be inside with students and parents providing pastoral support, while other clergy were going to be outside holding a media conference along with the union. So I think that kind of, to expand our concept of what pastoral care and support means, and that it also entails praying with our feet and participating in actions, nonviolent actions. And then finally, I'll just note that I think building intersectional, inclusive alliances and coalitions is critical, right? Again, it is imperative that we live out our values by really respecting and valuing the voices of those most impacted, and honoring that and working together and recognizing that in that way we build our beloved community that actually has more power to transform the current systems so that we can realize a society that is more equitable, just, compassionate, and I think more in alignment with the kinds of values that all of our faith traditions really seek to uphold.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this matter of not special interest, I think is really crucial. Labor is not just for a few working people, but one definition of the 99% is these are the people that all have to work for a living, right? And then the leadership of those most impacted, as you just said, Betty, right? These are not just people that we want to include, but in many ways, this is where the leadership comes from. This is where the deep insights come from. There's this question in the Q&A by a colleague from the Philippines, Carl Villamea. What are we up against, right? And it is oftentimes the people who are in the trenches, who are experiencing the greatest pressures in their own bodies, who can tell us, who know for a fact what we're up against. So all of this brings us together in a way that by nature has to be intersectional, right? This cannot be various fractions. This has to be all of us, led by those who are ultimately the ones who are experiencing these pressures the greatest. So thank you so much. KB, I'm curious about your response to that same question.
Well, I feel like I could just say ditto to everything Betty said and then just like leave it there because she's so smart and I just agree so much. But one of the things that Betty, what you said sparked for me was, yeah, how difficult it is for workers to organize. And I was thinking about the organizing in rural Pennsylvania with this amazing group of nurses. When they started organizing the union, the hospital, like happens every time workers organize a union, hired an anti-union consultant, a law firm that exists just to convince workers to vote no. And I felt like I was in the 1930s or something. They had burner phones. They were following workers home at night. They fired workers. They hired actual white supremacist union busters, self-identified white supremacist union busters, and said that the union funded abortions. I mean, it was just, and the question, why are they spending so many millions of dollars to stop 400 workers from having a union, right? And the truth is, in a place like in rural Pennsylvania, there's two places where people are in community with each other, their workplace and their churches. Those are the two centers of community, right? And so who benefits from those workers not having a union is the people who can continue to make short staff that hospital, and cut public services in rural communities, right? And I'm gonna share, I don't know if this comes out to everyone, if I put it in the chat, but just today, Bargaining for the Common Good released this report about all the people who are profiting in the pandemic, right? And so this is a group of billionaires who are making more money than ever before. And so when I think about what lies ahead and how do we tackle this immense wealth that's being accumulated in power, it's by working. It's actually not complicated. It's by, like Betty said, faith communities, unions, community groups coming together, because we all have the shared problems. We have the same people who are defunding our communities, are passing anti-immigrant laws, are passing anti-union laws. And when we work together, we can win. I mean, we see that in Chicago, where the teachers won smaller class size. We see that in Philly, where we won paid sick leave and protections for domestic workers who were excluded from the law and now have rights. So when faith communities and unions come together, I think it's actually one of the most powerful forces in the world, really. And we've seen again and again that it can really transform our political and economic system. So really think that's the path forward.
Wow, yeah, I wish we could spend another hour talking about these things, because I'm now more hopeful than I ever was in so many ways. Maybe one final question that was put to us in the Q&A. Brandon Desiderio is wondering, this is perhaps with President-elect Joe Biden a moment now that we can actually be hopeful about maybe the unions have a stronger role again and a stronger voice. But I'm guessing also that this will take some work. I mean, what's your assessment? Is this going to be a new golden age for the 99%? What are the final challenges? Maybe just quick comments from each of you. Where do we need to pay attention, and where do we still need to push now?
I can go first this time, Betty. I mean, I think that depends on us. I really do. Yeah, I don't think Biden's going to fix our problems, unfortunately. I'd much rather, have him as president as Trump. But I think the question is, can we build enough power across our communities with unions and faith and community groups coming together to win? And I think, are we in a better position now? Absolutely. But can we do the deep organizing? I mean, in a place like rural Pennsylvania, when we were organizing, how could it have been different if we did talk with the clergy right away and we did have an interfaith organization out in rural Pennsylvania that we could partner with and work with? That could have transformed that campaign. Those nurses could have won, and there could be long-term power building there. So to be honest, I think that we have a tall order ahead of us. I think there's a lot of work to do. But I do feel I feel optimistic, and I think it's up to us.
Thanks, Betty.
Yeah, I would just echo what KB shared 100%, and just say that I think what we also have seen in with this election is the coming together of a diverse, inclusive, right, intersectional coalition as well. People of various racial backgrounds, working people, LGBTQ plus communities, and people of faith. And so I think what is really key is that we have to continue to organize, and we have to continue to expand and build on our notion of who is of everyone's humanity, and how can we ensure that there are basic human rights for every single person. I mean, why is it that healthcare is not a universal right in the US, right? Housing, shelter. I mean, we have this homelessness crisis or houselessness crisis across the country, and LA, that it's also a racial equity crisis, where Black people in particular have higher rates of homelessness. I mean, in a society like that, we have to really alter the structures of power. And I think by really acting and again on our faith and coming together and building the broadest, most inclusive, powerful, beloved community possible, that's the way that we're going to win. It's going to take, you know, many generations, just as we stand on the shoulders of many who've come before us. How do we continue to pave the way towards a promised land, right, for others to come? And so, but I think by doing it together and really built based on our shared values, we can do it.
Yes, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of hope, a lot of encouragement. I want to repeat some of the terms that you've used. Deep organizing, KB talked about deep relationship, Betty talked about, I sometimes talk about deep solidarity, and those are the kinds of things that have to be intersectional. This is something where all of us are needed. The 99% have to work together in a new form of solidarity that not only respects difference, but puts them to use productively. And that will save us all eventually. This is not a special interest. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the hope that we have, the last good hope that something can still change. So let me thank both KB and Betty so much. We are at a time when we have to close. Let me say a few things in conclusion, and then, of course, I would invite everybody to stay in touch with us. You can find KB Brower and Betty Hung at their organizations. We've put those in the chat, I believe. And you can find us at the Wendland Cook program in Religion and Justice. So thank you, everybody, our audience, all the questions, for joining us in this ongoing series on diverse perspectives of religion and labor. We're working together across various boundaries. We're talking about economic, ecological, cultural, religious problems, and we're committed at the Wendland Cook program to analyzing the connections, investigating solutions, and organizing our communities, not just mobilizing, but really deep organizing, as we were reminded today. Our collaborators come from various walks of life, embodying different racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual identities. We come from different countries and backgrounds, yet all of us are involved in movements of liberation. So we would like to invite you to join us and to help us understand better where we can join you. For this purpose, we would like to continue these webinars. You will find us again next year. And you can join us again, find the information on our website, religionandjustice.org, sign up for our newsletter, take a look at our blog titled Interventions, where we're currently dealing with radical religion in the South. Yes, that's a real thing, and it's an old thing. It's not something that was just invented. We've dealt with cooperatives and religion, worker co-ops specifically, so we're hoping to stay in touch. We're hoping to hear from you, to learn from you. Thanks again to our panelists so much. You have given us so much, and see you all again next time, and we'll be in touch. Take care and all the best.